You wouldn't believe me if I told you I'd seen a pink swan. And in the 16th century, Europeans wouldn't believe you if you told them you'd seen a black swan. In fact, they used the expression black swan to describe the unbelievable. It wasn't until 1697 that Europeans first saw a black swan, when Vlaming discovered the Swan River. It's human nature to spin stories from limited facts. It's how we make sense of the world around us. Isn't it interesting how difficult it can be to remember a simple fact like somebody's name? But most of us can remember an entire fairy tale like Cinderella. And the stories we love best are the stories we already know. A few years ago, I was on a business trip in Houston. I was missing my kids, so I thought one evening I'll video conference my 5-year-old daughter. Now, Houston is 13 hours behind Perth, where it was morning. And I thought it would be fun to show her how it was nighttime where I was. So I shone my video camera out the window and I said, "You wouldn't believe it, but it's nighttime here." At first her face looked puzzled, as if she'd seen a pink swan. And then she said, "Daddy, stop trying to trick me." And my video conference came to an abrupt end. The story she knew was that day follows night follows day. She wouldn't believe that night and day could happen at the same time. Psychologists refer to our pattern-seeking tendency as the narrative fallacy. The narrative fallacy leads us to see events as stories with logical chains of cause and effect. And to see the narrative fallacy in action, you need look no further than a casino. In 1913, at the Monte Carlo Casino in Las Vegas, the roulette ball had fallen on the black square several times in a row. Gamblers, spotting an illusionary pattern, began to bet that the ball must soon fall on the red square. You wouldn't believe it, but the ball didn't fall on the red square until 27 turns later, by which time the gamblers had lost millions of dollars. Now, the narrative fallacy affects gamblers, but it strikes in other walks of life as well, including in medicine. What do you immediately think if I'm to ask, what causes stomach ulcers? Did anyone think stress? You wouldn't believe, but that story is a myth. In 1981, an intern physician called Barry Marshall was working in a Perth hospital. A pathologist there mentioned to Barry that he'd noticed something unusual on the biopsies of stomach ulcer and cancer patients. It was the same hardy bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. Now, Barry had an 80-year-old Russian patient who was extremely sick with stomach pain that was incurable. Barry thought he would try prescribing him a course of antibiotics. You wouldn't believe it, but 2 weeks later the patient returned, miraculously healed. Barry thought this was something he ought to share with gastroenterologists. Now, gastroenterologists think they're pretty good at identifying crap, and they thought that Barry's story was a pink swan. They wouldn't believe it. The conventional medical narrative was that stress causes ulcers. Bacteria can't survive in the acidic stomach environment, and medical breakthroughs don't come from interns in Perth. Barry's hands were tied. He couldn't experiment on mice because mice don't suffer from H. pylori, and it was unethical to experiment on people, except one. In desperation, Barry took some H. pylori from the stomach of a sick patient. He stirred it into a broth and he drank it. Who's looking forward to dinner? Within a few days, Barry became extremely ill with gastritis, the precursor to ulcers. His breath stank and he was continually vomiting. He took a biopsy of his own stomach and there he found H. pylori, strong evidence that bacteria are the cause of stomach ulcers. He then cured himself with a course of antibiotics. Barry's bravery prevented countless awful deaths, and he was awarded the 2005 Nobel Prize for Medicine. Part of Barry's story is how his curiosity uncovered the truth. However, the other part that I really like is how he overcame a powerful false narrative with another narrative. We all still know the story about stress causing ulcers, but now there's another story, the story of the Perth doctor who drank a cup of bacteria and overcame mainstream medical hubris. You wouldn't believe some of the other ways that the narrative fallacy has impacted medicine. The Hungarian doctor Ignaz Semmelweis discovered hand washing in 1847 and was ridiculed and died in a mental asylum. He'd noticed that doctors washing their hands and not washing, doctors doing autopsies and not washing the pus off their hands were transferring diseases to mothers delivering babies. And the narrative fallacy strikes in other fields as well, including science, journalism and law. The Roman Inquisition wouldn't believe Galileo's absurd, heretical story that the earth revolves around the sun. Journalists wouldn't believe the Wright brothers' nonsense story that they'd flown a machine until years after eyewitnesses reported it. And the prosecution wouldn't believe Lindy Chamberlain's far-fetched story that a dingo took her baby. Fortunately, there are some antidotes to the narrative fallacy. And the first of these is intellectual humility. Intellectual humility leaves us open to the possibility that we might be wrong. I might be right about that. It encourages us to be curious and to start listening to different perspectives. Second is that the narrative fallacy makes us vulnerable. Remember those poor gamblers in Las Vegas? Sometimes our critical thinking abilities are our only protection. And finally, sometimes in life we'll find ourselves up against a powerful false narrative. And as Barry Marshall learned, facts tell, but stories sell. Sometimes the only way to overcome one narrative is with another. That's my story about stories. Like a trusted friend, the stories we know comfort and guide us, and we use them to pass our culture and our wisdom through the generations. And tonight, stories have even helped me remember what I wanted to share with you. But as you've heard, the stories we know aren't always true, and we fall for the narrative fallacy. So what should you do if you hear a story that you wouldn't believe? My advice would be to be curious, and you might even discover a pink swan.